It's a Tuesday morning in October 2021, and Pastor James Williams walks into his Houston megachurch office for what should be another routine day. 3,000 people are expected this Sunday. The budget is $12 million annually. He's got a book deal pending, a podcast with 500,000 subscribers, and just last week he baptized 87 new believers. By any metric, he's at the peak of success. But instead of preparing his sermon, he opens his laptop and types out a resignation letter. He's done. Finished. And here's the thing that should terrify every church board in America. He's not alone. Not even close. Between 2020 and 2022, an estimated 1,500 pastors left their positions each month in the United States. That's not a typo. 1,500. Every single month. We're talking about roughly 18,000 pastors annually walking away from positions they once believed were their divine calling. And when we narrow the lens to megachurches, those behemoth operations with congregations of 2,000 or more, the exodus becomes even more startling. Over 1,000 lead pastors of significant churches resigned, retired early, or simply disappeared from ministry in a single year. What could cause such a mass departure? Was it a crisis of faith? Financial scandals? Burnout? The answer, as it turns out, is all of the above and something far more sinister that nobody saw coming. Let me take you back to where this really begins. Not to 2220, but to the golden age of the American megachurch, the 1980s. Picture this. Ronald Reagan is president, televangelism is exploding, and a new breed of pastor is emerging. They're charismatic, media-savvy, and they're building something Christianity has never quite seen before: spiritual corporations. We're talking about Willow Creek Community Church in Illinois, hitting 17,000 attendees per week. Saddleback Church in California, where Rick Warren is pioneering the seeker-sensitive model that will be copied by thousands. Joel Osteen inheriting his father's church in Houston and transforming it into a 16,000-seat phenomenon housed in a former NBA arena. This is Professor Archive, and if you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shape our world, you're in the right place. We dig deep into the archives of history to bring you the truth behind the headlines. These weren't just big churches, they were empires. Lakewood Church under Osteen pulls in an estimated $90 million annually. That's more than some Fortune 500 companies. The pastors became celebrities: book deals, speaking tours, private jets. T.D. Jakes, pastor of the Potter's House in Dallas, built a net worth estimated at $20 million. But here's what nobody talks about. The machine they built required them to be superhuman, and eventually that machine started eating them alive. Let me tell you about Carl Lentz. In 2010, he becomes the lead pastor of Hillsong Church's New York City campus. By 2017, he's baptizing Justin Bieber in NBA player Tyson Chandler's bathtub. He's got 1.2 million Instagram followers. Celebrities are flying in to hear him preach. GQ does a profile calling him the pastor to the stars. He's wearing $900 sneakers and ripped jeans, making Christianity cool for a generation that had written off the church. Then, November 2020, he's fired. The reason? Moral failures. Later, we find out about affairs, abuse of power, and a lifestyle that had spiraled completely out of control. But here's the twist. In interviews afterward, Lentz reveals something shocking. He says the pressure to maintain the brand, the image, the constant growth had become unbearable. He wasn't just a pastor, he was a product. And products that don't perform get discontinued. And Lentz wasn't an isolated case. Let's talk about James MacDonald, who built Harvest Bible Chapel in Illinois into a megachurch empire with 7 campuses and an international radio program reaching millions. In 2019, he was fired by his own elders after recordings surfaced of him making crude comments about other pastors and reports of financial mismanagement, totaling millions of dollars. The church he built, it collapsed. 6 of the 7 campuses closed within a year, or consider Mark Driscoll of Mars Hill Church in Seattle. At its peak in 2013, the church had 15,000 members across 15 locations. Driscoll was a best-selling author with millions of podcast downloads. By 2014, he resigned amid allegations of bullying, plagiarism, and using church funds to manipulate book sales. The entire church dissolved within months, 15,000 members, 15 campuses, gone. But these spectacular falls only tell part of the story. For every headline-grabbing scandal, there are hundreds of quieter exits. Pastors who simply couldn't do it anymore. Consider the data from a 2021 Barna Group study. 38% of pastors have seriously considered quitting full-time ministry in the past year. That's more than 1 in 3. Among megachurch pastors specifically, the number jumps to 42%. When asked why, 56% cited the immense stress and pressure of the role. But here's where it gets interesting. Stress from what exactly? The answer reveals the dark underbelly of the megachurch model itself. These pastors weren't just spiritual leaders, they were CEOs managing multi-million-dollar operations. They were content creators producing multiple sermons weekly, plus podcasts, blogs, and social media posts. They were marriage counselors, crisis managers, fundraisers, and brand ambassadors. A typical megachurch senior pastor works an average of 65 hours per week. But during the pandemic, that number exploded to over 80 hours as they tried to maintain operations while everything moved online. Let me paint you a picture of what a week looked like for Pastor Robert, a real megachurch pastor from Arizona who resigned in 2021. Monday, 8 a.m., staff meeting with 47 department heads. 10 a.m., meeting with the finance committee about a $3 million budget shortfall. Noon, lunch with a potential major donor. 2 p.m., counseling session with a couple in crisis. 4 p.m., emergency call because the children's ministry director just quit. 6 p.m., finally sitting down to start working on Sunday's sermon. Tuesday through Saturday, more of the same. Sunday, preach 3 identical services to 6,000 people, smile for selfies with 200 congregants, and do it all while pretending his marriage isn't falling apart and he hasn't seen his kids' soccer games in 3 months. Now, layer in the pandemic. Everything these churches were built on, large gatherings, emotional worship experiences, the electricity of thousands of people in one room, suddenly illegal. Overnight, they had to become tech companies. Live streaming, Zoom Bible studies, online giving platforms. And attendance? It cratered. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research found that megachurches, on average, lost 22% of their attendance between 2019 and 2021. And unlike smaller churches, they had massive overhead, million-dollar buildings, large staff payrolls, debt service on bonds. But here's the killer. Even after restrictions lifted, people didn't come back. Church attendance in America was already declining before COVID. In 2019, 47% of Americans reported attending church regularly. By 2022, 31%. That's a 16-point drop in 3 years, the sharpest decline in recorded American history. For megachurch pastors who had built their entire identity around growth metrics, nicknames like the fastest-growing church in America, watching the numbers plummet was devastating. I spoke with one former megachurch pastor who put it this way. For 20 years, we were told our success was proof of God's blessing. So when the success vanished, what did that mean? Had God abandoned us? Or had we been wrong about everything? That existential crisis leads us to an uncomfortable truth that many former megachurch pastors are now speaking about openly. The theology itself might have been the problem. The prosperity gospel, the seeker-sensitive model, the entertainment-driven worship. These approaches created churches that were a mile wide and an inch deep. They attracted crowds but didn't necessarily transform lives. And the pastors increasingly were having their own crises of faith. John Steingard, former lead singer of the Christian rock band Hawk Nelson and worship leader at multiple megachurches, went public with his deconversion in 2020, saying the performance aspect of megachurch ministry had made authentic faith impossible. But let's talk about something that rarely gets mentioned, the financial pressure that pushed pastors to the edge. Megachurches run on money. Enormous amounts of it. The average megachurch budget exceeds $6 million annually. The largest ones, over $100 million. Where does that money come from? Tithes and offerings from congregants, which means the pastor's primary job becomes keeping people happy, engaged, and giving. This created an insidious dynamic. Pastors couldn't preach hard truths that might offend donors. They couldn't make controversial statements that might drive people away. They had to be perpetually positive, inspiring, and entertaining. As one former pastor told NPR, "I became a motivational speaker with Bible verses, not a prophet." And then there was their own compensation. This is where things get really messy. The average salary for a megachurch senior pastor ranges from $150,000 to $500,000 per year. And that's not including book royalties, speaking fees, and other income streams. Some megachurch pastors were pulling in over $1 million annually, tax-free because churches don't have to disclose financial information. This created a lifestyle that became increasingly uncomfortable. How do you preach about helping the poor while driving a $200,000 car? How do you talk about sacrifice while living in a $2 million mansion? Some pastors rationalized it as God's blessing. Others, it ate at their conscience until they couldn't take it anymore. Perry Noble, founding pastor of New Spring Church in South Carolina, one of the fastest-growing churches in America, resigned in 2016 citing alcohol abuse and personal issues. Later, he admitted that the pressure to maintain the success, coupled with the guilt over his lavish lifestyle while preaching about Jesus, created a cognitive dissonance that drove him to drink. But perhaps the most revealing factor in the pastoral exodus is something researchers are calling celebrity pastor syndrome. When you become famous, you stop being a person and become a brand. And brands can't be vulnerable, they can't admit weakness, they can't have human struggles. Social media amplified this to an unbearable degree. Every sermon is now clipped and critiqued online, every statement analyzed for political implications, every outfit judged, every personal struggle exposed. It's like living in a fishbowl while sharks circle outside. Jared Wilson, a megachurch pastor and mental health advocate in California, died by suicide in September 2019. He had been open about his own struggles with depression, but even advocating for mental health awareness couldn't save him from the crushing pressure of maintaining the pastoral persona. His death sent shockwaves through the megachurch world, forcing an uncomfortable conversation about the toll this ministry model takes on human beings. The Barna research reveals that 23% of pastors have been diagnosed with clinical depression, and 35% report struggling with anxiety disorders. Among megachurch pastors, these numbers are even higher, yet they couldn't show it. Congregants don't want a depressed pastor. Donors don't give to anxious leaders. So they suffered in silence until they either collapsed or walked away. And we haven't even discussed the scandals, because while some pastors left due to burnout and disillusionment, others were pushed out due to moral failures that revealed just how toxic the megachurch environment had become. Ravi Zacharias, one of the most famous Christian apologists in the world, died in 2020. Within months, an investigation revealed decades of sexual abuse, manipulation, and predatory behavior toward vulnerable women. His entire ministry empire collapsed. Bill Hybels, founding pastor of Willow Creek Community Church, that model megachurch from the 1980s, resigned in 2018 after allegations of sexual harassment and abuse of power-spanning decades. The church that trained thousands of other megachurch pastors through its leadership conferences had covered up its founders' misconduct. The pattern is disturbing. The megachurch model, with its celebrity pastors, centralized power structure, and lack of accountability, created the perfect environment for abuse. Pastors became untouchable. Boards became yes men. Power corrupted, and absolute power corrupted absolutely. By the way, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how this content reaches people across the globe. But let's get back to the Exodus because we need to understand what happened next. As megachurch pastors started leaving in droves, something fascinating occurred. Many of them started talking. Really talking. Books were published. podcasts launched, memoirs written, and collectively they painted a picture of a system that had fundamentally broken. Josh Harris, author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye and former megachurch pastor, didn't just leave ministry in 2019, he left Christianity altogether. In a shocking Instagram post, he apologized for the harm his purity culture teachings had caused and announced he was no longer a Christian. The backlash was intense, but so was the support from other former pastors who understood the journey from true believer to disillusioned exile. This deconversion trend among former megachurch leaders is perhaps the most stunning aspect of the Exodus. These weren't people on the fringes of faith. They were the champions, the warriors, the public faces of evangelical Christianity. And they were walking away not just from ministry, but from belief itself. Why? The answer, according to many of them, is that when you're behind the curtain, you see how the magic trick works. You see the manipulation, the manufactured emotions, the business strategies dressed up as spiritual movements. You see how decisions are made based on metrics and money rather than theology or truth, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. But there's another layer to this story that's absolutely crucial. The people in the pews were changing too. Younger generations, particularly millennials and Gen Z, were increasingly skeptical of institutional religion, celebrity pastors, and the culture wars that megachurches had become entangled in. When dozens of prominent megachurch pastors endorsed Donald Trump in 2016, it triggered a mass exodus of younger congregants who felt the church had become too political. When megachurches stayed silent on racial justice issues or, worse, opposed Black Lives Matter protests, more people left. When LGBTQ+ issues became flashpoints, entire demographics walked out the door. The megachurch model had optimized for growth by avoiding controversy, but the world became so polarized that silence itself became a controversial stance. Pastors were damned if they spoke and damned if they didn't. Some chose to speak out and were fired by their conservative boards. Others stayed silent and watched their congregations dwindle as young people left to find churches actually engaged with justice issues. Pastor Rob Bell, founding pastor of Mars Hill Bible Church in Michigan, one of the fastest-growing churches in America, essentially got kicked out of evangelicalism for suggesting in his 2011 book Love Wins that a loving God might not send people to eternal torture in hell. His question was deemed heretical, and the backlarity, the attacks from fellow megachurch pastors, were vicious. He eventually left pastoral ministry altogether. The irony? In exit interviews, younger church members cited church's harsh stance on hell and traditional theology as a primary reason for leaving. Bell was perhaps ahead of his time, asking questions that were bubbling under the surface, questions that would eventually explode and take down dozens of other megachurch pastors who followed. The financial collapse of megachurches during the pandemic also revealed something deeply troubling. Many of these massive churches had no reserves, no rainy day funds, nothing to fall back on. They'd been running on the financial equivalent of fumes, using next week's offerings to pay last week's bills. When giving dropped 30–40% during lockdowns, mortgages on multi-million-dollar buildings suddenly became impossible to pay. Pastors who had built their entire ministries, whole campuses, massive building projects, found themselves facing bankruptcy. The shame of financial failure, the layoffs of beloved staff members, the selling off of properties, it broke many of them. They'd believed the prosperity gospel lie that if you have faith, God provides. When the money ran out, their theology shattered. Chris Hodges, pastor of Church of the Highlands in Alabama, one of the largest churches in America with over 60,000 weekly attendees, faced a different kind of crisis in 2020. After he liked social media posts from a conservative commentator that were perceived as racially insensitive, protests erupted. The Birmingham Board of Education and the Birmingham Housing Authority cut ties with his church, which had been running programs in schools and public housing. Though Hodges didn't resign, the incident showed how one click, one moment of judgment lapse could bring immense pressure on megachurch leaders. And here's something that doesn't get enough attention. The COVID pandemic gave pastors permission to slow down, maybe for the first time in their careers. When everything shut down, many of them went home to their families. They actually had dinner with their kids. They slept. They rested. And in that rest, they realized how utterly exhausted they'd been, how the constant grind had destroyed their health, their marriages, their relationships with their own children. A survey by Lifeway Research found that 47% of pastors said the pandemic made them consider leaving ministry, but 61% said it gave them time to reconnect with their families. For many, that reconnection made them realize what they'd been sacrificing. Their kids had grown up barely knowing them. Their marriages were hollow shells. They'd given everything to the church and had nothing left for the people they claimed to love most. So they made a choice. They chose their families over their congregations. They chose their sanity over success. They walked away. The question everyone asks is, where did they go? What happens to a megachurch pastor after they leave? The answers are surprisingly diverse. Some went into counseling or therapy, using their pastoral skills in a different context. Some became business consultants. After all, they'd run multi-million-dollar operations. Some went completely silent, taking corporate jobs far from the spotlight. Others became the loudest critics of the system they'd once championed. Podcasts like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill by Christianity Today expose the toxic leadership culture in megachurches. Ex-pastors wrote tell-all books. Some started progressive or deconstructionist communities that looked nothing like the megachurches they'd left behind. Small gatherings focused on questions rather than answers, doubt rather than certainty. And here's the thing that should concern anyone interested in the future of American religion. They're not being replaced. Churches are desperately searching for senior pastors and can't find them. Seminary enrollment has dropped 24% in the past decade. Young people aren't entering ministry, at least not at the megachurch level, because they've watched the previous generation burn out and crash. The megachurch model itself might be dying. Hartford Institute research shows that between 2015 and 2020, the number of megachurches in America actually declined for the first time since records began. Post-pandemic, that decline accelerated. Churches that once had 5,000 attendees are down to 2,000. Those with 2,000 are down to 800. The few megachurches that are growing are doing something radically different. They're ditching the celebrity pastor model, creating leadership teams instead. They're radically transparent with finances. They're engaging in social justice work. They're admitting doubt and uncertainty rather than projecting absolute confidence. If you appreciate deep dives like this into stories that matter, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It helps us keep producing content that goes beyond the headlines to find the truth. Every bit helps. But let's address the elephant in the room. Was the pastoral exodus good or bad for Christianity? The answer depends on who you ask. Progressive Christians and religious skeptics see it as the necessary collapse of a corrupt system. Conservative evangelicals view it as a crisis of faith and a spiritual attack. Those caught in the middle, the people who genuinely love their churches and their pastors, are just confused and hurt. What's undeniable is that the megachurch era of American Christianity fundamentally changed religion in this country. For better or worse, it turned pastors into celebrities, worship into entertainment, and churches into businesses. It made Christianity palatable and accessible to millions who might never have walked into a traditional church. But it also commodified faith, created cult of personality dynamics, and often prioritized growth over genuine spiritual formation. The pastors walking away aren't abandoning ship during calm seas. They're leaving a vessel that's taking on water. And while some are jumping to save themselves, others are sounding alarms, trying to warn the passengers still aboard that things need to change. One former megachurch pastor I spoke with, who asked to remain anonymous, put it this way: "For years we built bigger barns to store more grain, telling ourselves we were doing it for God. But we forgot that Jesus spent most of his time with 12 guys walking around dusty roads, not filling stadiums. Maybe the Exodus isn't a failure. Maybe it's a reset. Maybe we needed to lose everything to remember what mattered in the first place." The irony is thick. The megachurch movement was supposed to reach the unchurched to make Christianity relevant to modern America. Instead, it may have accelerated the very decline it sought to prevent. According to Pew Research, the percentage of Americans identifying as Christian dropped from 75% in 2011 to 63% in 2021, the fastest decline in American history. The megachurch era coincides almost perfectly with Christianity's decline in America. But out of the rubble, something new is emerging. Small, intentional communities, house churches, social justice-oriented ministries, digital communities that transcend geography. These don't have the flash or scale of megachurches, but they might have something more valuable: authenticity, accountability, and a focus on transformation over attendance numbers. The pastors who walked away might be the prophets of this new era, even if they don't see themselves that way. Their exodus is forcing a reckoning with questions that were long overdue. What is the church supposed to be? What does authentic faith look like? Can Christianity survive without the spectacle? As we watch this unfold in real time, one thing becomes clear. The story of the megachurch pastor exodus isn't just about religion. It's about the American addiction to bigger, faster, more successful. It's about celebrity culture and its inevitable corruption. It's about the human cost of institutions that prioritize growth over people. It's about what happens when the machine we build to serve our dreams becomes the machine that devours us. The pastors who walked out? They're not cowards. Most of them are people who gave decades of their lives to something they believed in with their whole hearts. They sacrificed their health, their families, and their private selves for a cause they thought was worth it. When they finally said enough, it wasn't weakness. It was the first honest thing many of them had done in years. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that 1,000 pastors left in 1 year, but that for the first time, they felt free to admit that the emperor had no clothes. That success doesn't equal spiritual health. That big doesn't mean better. That they're human beings who break under superhuman pressure. The American megachurch experiment isn't over, but it's clearly in crisis. The next decade will determine whether these massive institutions can adapt and survive, or whether they'll become religious relics, monuments to an era when Christianity tried to out-entertain Hollywood and out-market Madison Avenue, only to lose its soul in the process. What comes next? Nobody knows for certain. But the pastors who walked out have given us a gift, even if it doesn't feel like it. They've shown us what doesn't work. They've paid the price for the lessons we all need to learn. And perhaps in their exodus, in their courage to say, this isn't sustainable, they're modeling something more Christian than anything they did from those megachurch pulpits. They're modeling truth-telling, even when it costs you everything. The megachurch pastor exodus of 2020-2022 will be studied by sociologists and religious scholars for generations. It's a watershed moment in American religious history. But for the families of those pastors, for the congregations left behind, for the individuals struggling to make sense of it all, it's not history. It's right now. It's raw. It's painful. And it's necessary. This has been Professor Archive. If this content made you think, made you question, or taught you something you didn't know, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop searching for truth wherever it leads you.